Disruptors and curious minds. Welcome to the Thinking on Paper book club. And each week, me and Jeremy, and hopefully soon we'll have some other people here, talk about a book. Each week we break down, explore, imagine, ask questions, deep dive a chapter of the book. Books which we think will change how you work, rest, and play, to quote Mars Bar. So, The Design of Everyday Things by Don Norman. I think you had a great description of this book last week, Jeremy, when you said that it's kind of like this is what they teach at university when you go do a design course.
Yeah, and it's definitely an interesting there's a connection too. I think I was inspired by our last book, The Nexus, because what he talked about, the author of that book, Julio Tino, talked about is design being the connectivity between art, technology, and science, right?
Yeah.
So that's why we're here, man. So we've been through chapter 1, kind of a precursor, right? To what's happening in the book. Where did you jump into with chapter 2? What drew you in first?
What drew me in first was probably what drew me in first was my own thermostat. And I don't mean my personal inner thermostat. I actually mean the thermostat in my house, because it is atrocious. And every single thing that Don Norman speaks about in chapter 2, my thermostat is guilty of from a design perspective. So in chapter 2, he speaks about the gulf of execution evaluation, the 7 stages of action, root cause analysis, learned helplessness, feed forward, which is a very interesting idea, emotional design flow, levels of processing, collaboration, psychology, storytelling, blame. I think that going back to my thermostat and this book and chapter 2, and I think one of the key things, or the theme of chapter 2, is blame. It's that people blame themselves for their inability to use technology, and it isn't their fault. It's the design of the technology which is at fault. And then he explains why that is in chapter 2. He uses these learned helplessness, action, the gulf of execution. Just sorry to go on about my thermostat, but basically it's impossible to use. There's no feedback, there's no conceptual model. You don't have anything which tells you how to make the house the temperature you need. And so we'll talk about maybe the gulf of execution, which is what's going to happen, and the gulf of evaluation, which is what happened. And I get none of those.
Well, the blame in my thermostat
over.
My thermostat equally sucks too. Don't get me started on the Apple TV interface. We can break that down at some point as well. But the interesting thing you mentioned is that we do blame ourselves when we can't do something, right?
Yes.
But here's why it's really hard to build great experiences, is because most of us, when we aren't able to do something, we don't want to tell people that we can't do it. We just want to, go in a corner and beat ourselves up and feel bad about it, and not use the product, right? So it's what he calls a conspiracy of silence, which is really interesting. Like, I don't want to tell you I don't know how to do something, because that's going to make me look uninformed and unintelligent, or whatever it may be, right?
Yeah, and I think he says something that, from a design point of view, you can't remove emotion from the design, because if it's good or if it's bad, people are going to be frustrated or angry or delightful or happy. And as I've just demonstrated with my thermostat, you can't remove emotion from cognition. So getting the user experience right, so that when it's going to sound funny, but getting the user experience right so that when things go wrong, there is a way to get back on track with the design, is a big part in this chapter of what makes good design. And so we don't feel personally responsible for our inability to change a channel or turn on a light or open a door, as we demonstrated last week.
So cognition and emotion. Yeah.
Yeah.
I landed right into this and was super interested that, there's what he calls a biochemical interaction between those two things, right?
Yeah.
And cognition is, our attempts to make sense of the world, right? And emotion is our means to assign value uh, to what we find, and both need to be taken into account. And one is conscious and one is subconscious, right?
Yeah.
Um, Super interesting. I mean, and the thought like that the framework and the thought that goes into building really great experiences take all of these things into account, and really bad experiences are just things that get invented and people want to push them out and they don't want to think about all of these intricacies, right?
Yeah. I think he has what he calls the 7 stages of action, which so you have the person, you have their goal, you have the steps between those, which are going to cause some level of emotional reaction. He outlines the 7 stages: 1 for goals, 3 for execution, and 3 for evaluation. So he talks about goal, plan, specify, perform, perceive, interpret, compare. Um, Again, I'm not a designer, so he says that if the user can go through those steps and they are all answered in a easy to digest way, then I mean, you don't need to have all of those steps, but if they can all be answered, you have a good design.
Well, I'm going to push you on that a little bit. You are a designer, right? Even though you're not designing products, we're designing thinking on paper experiences, conversations, explorations, right? So design, all of us are designers, right? Which
You're
I
right.
think is what's interesting about the book. What did you think about the brain processing or the high level types of brain processing when he talks? And again, neuroscience is far more complicated than this, but think about reflective, behavioral, and visceral means of processing in the brain. How did all of that stuff land and inform, any outputs for you on that? What did you think about all that?
page page 47. And good design has to incorporate all 3 of those. He says, I guess it's not a surprise that visceral processing was so important. And visceral processing is what something looks like. We if it looks good, it's almost like a hook, isn't it? So I guess I was surprised, but I shouldn't be surprised by how important visceral processing is.
Well, let's chat it before you go on to the next one. And I want to chat about visceral a little bit, right? So what he pointed out that I thought was really interesting, a couple of things. Visceral is a precursor to emotion, right? So there's no real emotion tied to visceral processing. Visceral is more fight or flight, right? We see something and we immediately react based on our conceptual models. Um, but he also mentions during visceral processing, it minimizes your ability to learn, which is kind of really interesting to me.
is that
Um,
the lizard brain kind of like hijacks your hypothalamus and
exactly
or
right.
almost puts your brain on standby as the lizard takes care of things.
Yeah, and then on the behavioral side, this is kind of where the learned skills kind of come into play, like what we've learned and how what we've learned has informed, what we think can happen with this experience. But this is also where expectation based emotions come in, which is like with your thermostat, you hope to make your house warmer. And when you can't make your house warmer and it starts, doing things you don't want it to do, you get pissed off, right? So
For
this is kind of
designers, the most critical aspect of the behavioral level is that every action is associated with an expectation, as you say.
correct.
And
And
when
then
those
and then we think about reflective. So why is the reflective processing piece so important? The author says this is actually the part of the brain that drives whether you recommend a product or an experience.
oh, that's interesting.
And this is where deep understanding of something happens, right? Um, but it's also where blame or praise are assigned.
Okay, so word of mouth recommending something, that can I just dig down into that? Like,
Yeah.
um, how would we the design of thinking on paper, how would we use that to get people to recommend the show? What in our design?
That's wow. That's a big question. Um,
Well, you think about that because one of the things about this book is it asks quite a lot of questions. Like I've written a lot of the notes I've written are in fact questions for me to think about. So that's another question. But one of the questions, most well, I won't go into that. I'll let. Have you got an answer?
well, I think the big thing that I think we should think about doing as it relates to thinking on paper is we need to build like the goal is to build a crystal clear conceptual model of what thinking on paper is. Meaning when someone interacts with a show, with the book club, with some other thing that we're doing, they're like, oh, Mark and Jeremy do XYZ, and here's how it can help me. And here's how I interact with it. I can go here, I can do this, I can do that. But I think having that crystal clear map is or that clear conceptual model is what starts ringing for me.
I like that a lot.
The last thing I want to point out in this one, and I know we could go long on this one, but I want to kind of keep these reasonable, is the release of the tension of expectation creates a sense of relief. Tension of expectation, that's really interesting to me. And going back to a musical reference, right? When like a minor chord resolves to a major fifth or something, there's like this sense of relief. It's like there's this tension and then there's this relief. So when you experience a new product, you go into it maybe excited to, based on if it was built up with some hype, but you're also like, man, am I going to be able to work this thing? Am I going to be able to do some of this stuff? So there's like this like tense moment. So maybe limiting that amount of tension, knowing that it's going to be there anyway. How do you limit the tension and create that resolution sooner than later? So I thought that was really interesting.
I really like that musical analogy. Learned well, there's quite a few things. One of the things about the book, it's quite a long chapter, so there's a lot of things we could talk about. Panic bars on doors, for example, but learned helplessness, I think, was one of the things. The phenomenon called learned helplessness might explain the self-blame. Do common technology and mathematical phobias result from a kind of learned helplessness? Could a few instances of failure in what appear to be straightforward situations generalize to every technological object, every mathematical problem? Perhaps. And I think that, okay, a lot of our listeners work in Web3. The big narrative of the last 2 years has been onboarding that, mass adoption, that ugly word, and the complexity of blockchain wallets and just how infuriating they are. And literally you try once or twice and that's it, you're out of the game. And he's like, okay, I don't understand it, I'll never understand it. And then that can filter across to other technologies. Do you
Yeah. So the onboarding thing, now that we're like, a couple years beyond the enthusiasm of embracing a new collection of technologies, onboarding to me, looking back on it now, is like, all right, how do we force people that are mildly interested to force them into a very complicated process with a vague desire of beneficial outcome? Like that's where I land with a lot of that stuff. And versus like, how do we create an experience that's going to be easy, tied to existing thinking that is clear and beneficial to the outcome, right? The conceptual map of Web3 has not been built yet properly.
Agreed, yes. I couldn't have put it better myself. Feed forward from a design perspective. Had you heard of feed forward before?
No, I hadn't. I thought that was super interesting. I don't, where did you like, how do you create your own definition of that now that you've read it? Like, what does feed forward mean to you now that you've kind of processed it?
Um, when I first read it, I was like, "What, feed forward?" It's very difficult to, because feedback is so ingrained in our subconscious that anything that kind of plays with that was kind of discombobulating for a while. Feed forward, feed forward. It just sounds wrong. But feedback is information after the event. Feed forward is information before the event. So if you're from a design perspective, signaling, so the user knows what to expect might happen or will happen.
That's a great way to think of it there, Mark. And I think the way I think about feed forward, I was I'm a lacrosse coach for high school and youth, and I was a CrossFit like strength and conditioning trainer for a long time that required helping people improve their form and function and understanding of movement. So think about it. Let's go like if I'm teaching you how to squat, right? With a barbell on your back, there's a particular form that I want you to follow to make sure A, you don't get hurt. B, it's the most beneficial to your muscles with the least amount of, you're very efficient in your movement, right? So feed forward to me during you trying the squat would be the feedback, the cues that I give you to make sure you're in proper alignment for the experience and the outcome. Like it's like these little bets, not these little bets, but these little cues along the journey before before you even interact with the product or as you're becoming more interactive with the product.
I like that. That makes sense. Feed forward. I'm going to try and use it.
Feed forward. Yeah, that's great. I love it. There's a lot of really good stuff in this chapter. I agree.
There are. One thing that I mean, we've already been going 20 minutes. If anyone is watching this or listening to this and you are a professional designer, you create websites, you create UX in any, or you'd like to come and talk about your design process, because we're going to be at this for a few weeks. So that would be really awesome if you could come and explain your design process. I'll finish with a question which he asks in this, and he speaks about the idea of collaboration with machines and humans and machines collaborating in the experience. So obviously this isn't going to apply to radiators and my thermostat, although it could if I got a new thermostat, whereby the machine helps you and you help it, and it have this collaborative experiential thing. And I thought that was a really good thing to think about.
Yeah, I think that one little quote, and I'm going to paraphrase this at the end. It's very good takeaway for this, and also a fun extension from the Nexus that we read is like products are interactions and collaborations with complex systems.
Works for me.
Chapter 2, we're locked in on the books. Chapter 3 coming up next. Again, UX, UI, product designers would love to pull you in on this next episode. Mark, that's a great idea. We should reach out to some.
Yeah.
Check out our show. Goes live Thursdays, 10:30 a.m. Eastern, 15:30 GMT. Thinkingonpaper.xyz. See you soon.
Keep thinking on paper.